In 1326, in London, a man named Richard suffocated beneath the cesspit of an entire residential block. No tombstone, no funeral. The city registry recorded exactly one line, "Died of noxious gases while on duty." Richard was just one of thousands of people forced to crawl into cesspits, sewers, and piles of rotting corpses to keep medieval European cities from drowning in trash and disease. Behind the brightly lit castles and royal banquets were human beings living alongside toxic gases, blood, pus, chemicals, and pathogens every single day. What drove them to accept such grotesque and lethal jobs just to survive? That is merely the beginning, because beneath the gold-gilded halls of medieval Europe existed an entire underclass forced to live amidst human feces, rotting flesh, and plagues so that society would not collapse. Fact 1. The cesspool cleaner, gong farmer. Before underground sewers and flushing toilets existed, tens of thousands of people in medieval cities still had to relieve themselves daily. And all of that waste went to only one place, deep cesspits dug right under the floors of homes. When these pits filled to the brim, history birthed a profession almost no one wanted to touch: the gong farmer, the cesspool cleaner. They rarely worked during the day. Many European cities mandated that these men could only operate from midnight until dawn, because the stench from the dredging process was strong enough to make entire neighborhoods vomit if it occurred in broad daylight. In the darkness, they dragged shovels, wooden buckets, and waste carts through narrow alleys. When the hatch to the pit was pried open, a wave of hot air, thick with the smell of human waste accumulated over months, hit them directly in the face. Then, a worker tied a rope around his waist and climbed down. The space below was so cramped that many could only work bent over. The waste reached their chests. They used shovels to scoop the thick muck into buckets for those above to haul up. But very often, shovels were useless. They had to use their bare hands to stir and scrape the dense sludge at the bottom of the pit. And the most dangerous thing was what they couldn't see. Methane and toxic gases produced by decomposition often accumulated heavily at the bottom of the pit. After inhaling too much for just a few minutes, the worker would become dizzy, struggle to breathe, and collapse right there in the dark. Many suffocated or slipped, sinking straight into the cesspool before they could be pulled up in time. Some urban records of the era even describe bodies being recovered hours later with their mouths and lungs filled with liquid waste. So why did anyone still do this job? Because of the money. Because so few dared to climb into those holes. Gong farmers were often paid quite handsomely compared to common laborers. Just a few nights of dredging could earn enough to buy food for an entire family to survive the winter. But the trade-off was almost absolute ostracization. The stench seeped into their hair, skin, and clothes to the point where it was practically impossible to wash off entirely. When they walked down the street, others would automatically step aside or plug their noses. Many gong farmers were pushed to live on the fringes of towns, segregated from the rest of society. They kept the entire city from being buried in its own waste, only to be treated by that very city as something filthy to be avoided. And if you think diving into a cesspool is the pinnacle of disgust, it isn't. At least the gong farmer died from something outside their body. The next profession caused the very flesh of the worker to slowly rot away day by day under the effects of chemicals and decomposing animal corpses. Fact 2. The leather worker, tanner. Today, Owning a leather jacket or leather shoes evokes a sense of luxury and durability. But in 13th and 14th century Europe, creating leather armor for soldiers or saddles for the nobility came at the cost of the worker's own flesh. A medieval tannery wasn't just a workplace. It was like a massive biological experimentation zone, where the human body was gradually soaked in chemicals, animal corpses, and decomposition. The ingredients used to process leather back then were enough to kill anyone's appetite. To remove hair and soften fresh cow or sheep hides, tanneries used a mixture of human urine, dog feces, and water steeped with rotting animal organs. Urine was collected from public chamber pots because its ammonia content helped strip away hair. Dog feces contained natural enzymes capable of breaking down tissues and fat clinging to the hide. And the vats of decomposing organs produced a stench so pungent that just standing near them for a few minutes was enough to make stomachs cramp. And the tanner didn't just stand next to them. They had to step entirely inside. There were no machines, no rubber gloves. The worker had to soak their bare feet in massive wooden vats filled with thick, sludgy liquid, using their hands to squeeze, pull, knead, and utilizing their entire body weight to trample the hides for hours on end. The liquid beneath their feet wasn't just dirty water. It was a fermenting concoction of dissolved animal fat, feces, urine, and crude chemicals baking under the summer heat. After a few months of this work, the worker's body began to visibly mutate. The skin on their hands turned violently red before splitting into deep cracks as if slashed by knives. Their fingernails turned mushy, discolored into a murky yellow, or peeled entirely off their fingertips. Many developed festering ulcers around their ankles from standing too long in corrosive solutions, when bacteria from animal corpses infiltrated open cracks. The flesh around the wounds would swell, ooze fluid, and reek of the distinct, metallic stench of infection. There were workers whose hands became almost permanently deformed after just a few years of living in the tanning vats. The terrifying part is that the stench never left them. The mixture of ammonia, dead skin, and animal corpses seeped straight into their hair, nails, and every layer of clothing, even when they left the workshop. Others could identify a tanner from several meters away just by smell. Many documents record that tanning districts were often pushed to the absolute fringes of the city or downriver, as residents believed the miasma rising from them carried disease. That is the paradox of this profession. All of society needed the products they created, but no one wanted to live near them. The tanners existed quietly amidst the smell of chemicals and decomposing hides, trading their own health and appearance to create a material that the nobility wore as a symbol of power. But no matter how horrific, the tanner at least only had to work with animal corpses. In the next profession, the things piled up on the carts were no longer cow hides or cattle organs, but human bodies beginning to bloat and discolor under the sun. Fact 3. The plague corpse collector. In 1347, when the Black Death swept across Europe, many crowded cities were virtually extinguished in just a few weeks. Markets vanished. Houses were boarded shut. Streets that were once bustling now echoed only with the grinding of wooden wheels against stone and the dry. Rhythmic toll of a brass bell piercing the cold fog. To the residents of that era, that sound held only one meaning: the corpse collectors were coming. Their job was to go from house to house, knocking on doors where no one answered anymore, then stepping inside to drag out bodies that had laid motionless for days. The vast majority of victims killed by the plague bore terrifying signs: swollen, black buboes protruding from their armpits, necks and groins, skin turned dark purple, and many bodies beginning to bloat from decomposition under the summer heat. There were rooms where the stench of death was so thick that anyone walking in would instantly dry heave right at the door. The corpse collectors had virtually no protection other than a few layers of linen tied across their faces. They had to use bare hands to drag limp bodies off beds, off floors, or out of dark corners where the sick had died alone days prior. Some bodies were already leaking fluids. Skin would slough off arms just from being gripped too tightly. There were carts piled so high with corpses stacked on top of one another that limbs dangled and swayed with every jolt of the cart over the cobblestones. Their final destination was the mass graves on the outskirts of the city. No coffins, no tombstones. Human bodies were tossed down in layers and hastily covered with dirt. In many accounts, people described pale, gray arms still protruding from the ground after heavy rains, as if the city itself could not bury all the people who had died. The most horrific part was that the corpse collectors knew perfectly well they would meet the exact same fate. Every time they stepped into an infected house, they were gambling their lives again. Many who dragged carts through the streets early in the morning would, a few days later, begin running high fevers, developing buboes, and becoming the next corpse lying on the very cart they used to push. Gradually, the sound of their bell was no longer merely a signal to clear out the dead. It became the sound of despair. Just hearing the bell echo from the end of the street was enough for families to slam their windows shut, pull children inside, and avoid looking out wherever the cart went. Silence followed. They existed as escorts of death, needed by the entire city, yet feared by the entire city. But, at least, they were still working under the sky. If you look down beneath those cobblestone streets, deep within the slimy, pitch-black sewers, there existed yet another underclass living among sewage and dead rats, using bare hands to scrape for scraps of metal in exchange for a few more days of survival. Fact 4. The sewer hunter Toscher. Beneath the crowded streets of European metropolises was a world almost entirely severed from the sunlight. The early sewer systems were nothing like modern enclosed pipes. They were low, dark, mud-floored brick labyrinths, thick with the stench of wastewater, animal corpses, and garbage rotting for months. And within that darkness existed the sewer hunters, surviving by scavenging through what the rest of the city threw away. They descended into the sewers with an iron hook, a flickering oil lantern, and almost nothing else. There were sections of the sewer so low that a grown man had to hunch over or crawl on his knees through the thick black sludge. The water swirling around their feet wasn't just dirty. It contained blood from slaughterhouses, human feces, bloated carcasses of cats and rats, and countless shards of glass and sharp metal washed down from the surface. These sewer hunters used their bare hands to grope beneath the sludge, searching for anything of value: copper coins, silver spoons, iron nails, brass locks, even gold teeth from corpses flushed down into the drains. A single glint under the lantern light was enough to trade for bread or a place to sleep for the night. Some spent hours clawing through the toxic mix just to find a few coins coated in black mud and white maggots. Their bodies were rapidly eroded by the subterranean environment. The skin on their legs frequently ulcerated from soaking too long in bacteria-infested wastewater. Minor cuts from rusted metal easily morphed into festering, pus-filled infections. Many suffered chronic fevers, coughed up black phlegm, or developed rashes that never fully healed. Giant sewer rats scurried over their legs every night, leaving behind bites laden with disease. And down there, death could arrive extraordinarily fast. A sudden heavy downpour was enough to turn the entire sewer system into a muddy, raging flood in minutes. The water levels spiked, lanterns were snuffed out, and the sewer hunters were swept into a darkness thick with mud and garbage, while no one on the surface even knew they were trapped below. There were bodies that were only found days later, pinned against debris, grates with skin already beginning to slough off the bone. Many didn't even have homes to return to. They slept right inside the rare dry brick alcoves within the sewers, living like creatures swallowed and then forgotten by the city, while the nobility above hosted banquets by candlelight. Beneath their feet were human beings wading through waste to scrape together a living day by day. Worse still, filth and danger did not only exist down in the sewers, even in the gold and silver-draped halls of the nobility. A person could die right after a meal because sometimes the most dangerous thing on the banquet table wasn't a dagger. It was the very food being served. Fact 5. The food taster. Step into the banquet hall of European nobility, and you would see candlelight reflecting off silver platters, red wine swirling in crystal goblets, and luxurious dishes covering the length of the table. To commoners struggling on the streets, sitting before such a feast seemed almost like a dream. But for the food taster, every time a spoon was raised to their lips, it was a gamble with their life. In many medieval and Renaissance courts, poisoning was the most discreet and effective way to eliminate rivals. A little unknown powder in a goblet of wine, a few drops of poison stirred into a sauce, was enough to kill a king slowly without ever drawing a sword. Thus, the food taster existed as a living shield made of flesh and bone. When the dishes were brought out, the entire room would often fall silent for a few brief seconds. The food taster stepped up to the table, cut a small piece from the king's plate of meat, or took a sip of wine under the watchful eyes of dozens of people. Then they swallowed and waited. That was the most terrifying part. No one knew what was sitting in their stomach. There were poisons that took effect almost instantaneously. Lips began to turn purple, pupils constricted, chests convulsed as if being crushed from the inside. Some victims vomited blood right in the middle of the great hall, before collapsing onto the cold stone floor under the gaze of every guest. The horror was that these poisons killed slowly. The food taster could still stand, bow, and leave the banquet as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until hours later that the pain began crawling through their organs. The stomach cramped violently, limbs grew cold, the body lost strength bit by bit, as if something was silently gnawing at it from within. There were those who died days after tasting the food, emaciated and contorted because the poison had already seeped through their entire body. What tortured them was not just the physical danger, but the fear that repeated every single day. 3 meals a day. They had to stare down luxurious plates, never knowing which dish might be their last. A slightly unusual flavor in the soup was enough to send cold sweat running down their spine. They didn't eat to enjoy. They ate to absorb death in someone else's place. In the eyes of royalty, they were a necessary layer of protection. In reality, they were merely expendable pawns in the silent power struggles taking place behind the throne. But no matter how silently death arrived on the banquet table, it still occurred behind velvet curtains and lavish candlelight. In the central square, the end took an entirely different form, public, bloody, and executed by a person whom society simultaneously needed and feared. Fact 6. The executioner. He who delivers the verdict. When a death sentence was announced, the central square was often packed tightly with people. The crowd shoved against each other to get a clear view of the wooden execution scaffold erected in the middle of the city. But the moment the executioner stepped out with an axe or longsword in hand, the noise almost immediately died down. He was the representative of the law, but at the same time, he was one of the most despised and feared figures in society. In the minds of medieval Europeans, a person who frequently took the lives of others carried a stain that could never be washed away. Hands that had touched the blood and necks of the dead were seen as carrying bad omens. Therefore, most executioners were forced to live in isolation on the fringes of the town. Far from normal residential areas, the stigma crept into every corner of their lives. When buying food, many merchants would not allow executioners to touch the goods or money directly. They had to drop their coins into a bowl of vinegar set on the counter to wash away the evil aura. Children avoided the executioner's children. Guilds refused to take them on as apprentices. Many executioner families ultimately had no choice but to marry into other executioner families, creating bloodlines of death that spanned generations. But the social isolation wasn't even the heaviest burden. Their job was to look straight into the eyes of people who knew they were about to die. They heard the crying, the begging, the final words before the axe fell, and things didn't always go as quickly or cleanly as the crowd hoped. A misaligned strike could result in the victim not dying immediately. There were executioners who had to swing the axe a second or third time amidst the chaotic screaming of the square. After every execution, blood splattered onto their clothes, stuck to their hair, and coated their hands. The metallic stench of fresh blood lingered on their bodies for hours after the crowd had dispersed. Some local documents record that many executioners lived extremely reclusive lives outside of working hours. Some donated heavily to the church, as if trying to purchase forgiveness for their souls. Some avoided communication entirely, existing silently like ghosts on the edge of society, hired to do the thing no one else was willing to do with their own hands. The executioner used a blade to end lives in front of thousands of eyes. But in another corner of the city, similar sharp tools were being used for an entirely opposite purpose: healing. The only issue was that in medieval medicine, the boundary between saving a life and making a patient die faster was sometimes as thin as a cut in the flesh. Fact 7. The barber surgeon healer with a blade. If you walked down a medieval European street and saw a red and white striped pole spinning slowly outside a shop, don't assume it was just a place for a haircut. That was the domain of the barber surgeon, a place where a wooden chair might be used for a morning shave, and then transformed into a crude operating table by the afternoon. In that era, many academic physicians viewed direct contact with blood or pus as lowly work. They diagnosed illnesses through books, while physical interventions on living bodies were shoved onto barbers' men who were already accustomed to handling knives, scissors, and sharp razors every day. And so, amidst the smell of cheap soap and hair clippings scattered across the floor, incredibly risky treatments began to take place. Customers entered the shop not just for a mustache trim or a haircut. They came with rotting teeth throbbing into their skulls, purple, swollen abscesses, infected arms needing to be lanced for pus, or flesh that had already begun necrotizing and turning black-gray. In the corner of the room, handsaws, tooth-pulling pliers, and metal scalpels lay jumbled on a wooden table stained with dried blood. The terrifying part is that many of those tools had just been used on the previous person a few minutes prior. The concept of true sterilization did not exist. A blade that had just scraped soap foam off a customer's chin could instantly be used to slice a deep gash into the next person's bicep. Blood, pus, and bodily fluids mixed together on rags reused countless times. The barber's hands constantly reeked of the cold, metallic smell of human blood, lodged deep beneath their fingernails. But the true horror began when the procedure took place. No anesthesia, no numbing agents, no effective method of pain relief whatsoever. The patient was pinned down to the wooden chair, gritting their teeth until their gums bled as the blade sliced through flesh. Some screamed until their voices gave out. Others passed out midway from agony or blood loss. During tooth extractions, the barber had to use the full force of their arm to violently yank the rotting tooth from the jaw, sometimes ripping out chunks of the gum and producing the gruesome sound of cracking alveolar bone. Many patients survived the procedure, only to die days later from infection. The cuts began to burn, turning deep purple before oozing cloudy yellow fluid. Prolonged fevers incinerated their bodies from the inside out, while the barbers remained completely unaware that what was truly killing the patients was bacteria. Even the red and white striped symbol outside the shop carries a haunting origin. It is believed that the red stripes represent blood, and the white stripes represent the bandages wrapped around patients' arms during bloodletting. After the procedure, those blood-soaked rags were often given a rudimentary wash and hung outside the door to dry in the cold wind, creating the image that later evolved into the symbol of the barbering industry, leaving the chair of the barber surgeon. The lucky ones merely walked away with more scars. The unlucky ones silently stepped closer to the grave. But when life truly ended, another class emerged to handle the remaining physical matter, and their work began with animal corpses bloating in the streets under the blistering heat and swarms of flies. Fact 8. The animal corpse disposer knacker. On the fringes of medieval cities, where mud replaced cobblestones and the air always carried the scent of decay, existed a class almost completely invisible to society, the knacker. The people specialized in disposing of dead animals. In an era where every cart, cargo load, and army relied on the pulling power of livestock, animal deaths were a daily occurrence. Exhausted horses collapsed in the middle of the road. Sick cows bloated outside the markets. Stray dogs died stiff in garbage-filled alleys. If no one cleaned them up, those rotting masses of flesh would quickly turn into epicenters of disease right in the heart of the metropolis. And that was when the knacker appeared. They dragged heavy wooden carts, carrying iron hooks, ropes, and large cleavers to haul animal corpses onto their wagons. This job wore down both body and mind. A dead horse could weigh hundreds of kilograms. When the corpse began to fill with gas, its abdomen swelled as if it were about to explode. A single misjudged cut could cause foul-smelling gas and putrid fluids to erupt straight into the handler's face. At the knacker's yard, the dismantling process began. Blades chopped deep into skin that was turning mushy from decomposition. Bones were severed from joints using metal hammers. Organs were yanked from the abdominal cavity with the squelching sound of slime hitting the sticky ground. The air was thick with the smell of old blood, rancid fat, and dead bodies fermenting under the outdoor heat. The most horrific aspect was the insects. Swarms of flies blackened the entire yard. Maggots writhed inside cavities of flesh, sloughing off in chunks. Just standing nearby for a few minutes, the stench clung to the back of the throat, as if your own lungs were rotting from the inside. Under the knacker's hands, almost no part of the animal was wasted. Bones were boiled down for industrial glue and fat. Hides were sent to the tanneries. Usable flesh was ground into food for hunting hounds. They made a living by salvaging what remained of death. Yet society viewed them as no different than the rotting corpses they handled every day. The smell of decomposition seeped so deeply into the knacker's hair, skin, and clothes that it was practically impossible to wash out. Citizens avoided standing near them in the market. Children were forbidden from wandering near their yards. Many believed that just touching a knacker was enough to bring disease and bad luck. And in many cases, they did truly die because of the job. A single tiny cut while handling a diseased corpse could lead to a severe infection. High fevers, skin diseases, and lung damage were common occurrences. They kept the city from being submerged in dead bodies and plagues. But in return, they were shoved to the absolute bottom of society, living quietly amidst mud, the stench of death, and the contempt of the very people they served. Cleaning up foul-smelling things has always been considered the work of the lowest class. But history sometimes operates in highly ironic ways, because in the courts of Europe, there once existed a profession that sounded far more humiliating and intimate, yet allowed the person holding it to stand closer to absolute power than the vast majority of the kingdom's nobility. Fact 9. The royal toilet attendant groom of the stool. In the minds of most people, jobs dealing with personal waste usually sit at the very bottom of the class system. But European history contains a paradox that is almost unbelievable. In the Tudor court of England, there was a title that many powerful nobles secretly lusted after: groom of the stool, the person who directly attended to the monarch's most private bathroom needs. At first glance, it sounds like an unimaginably humiliating job. But in the royal world, physical proximity to the king was sometimes more valuable than a noble crest or thousands of acres of land. In many palaces of that era, the concept of privacy practically did not exist for the head of the kingdom. Even the most primal bodily functions were dragged into the machinery of power, and the groom of the stool was the person present during those moments of absolute privacy. They prepared the red velvet padded commode in a closed room, brought warm water, clean linen towels, and vials of aromatics to mask the body odors. But their duties did not end with cleaning up. The person holding this title also had to closely inspect the king's excretions, the color, texture, smell, and any abnormal signs in the waste. In an age where medicine was still ambiguous, this was considered one of the most critical methods of monitoring royal health. A prolonged bout of constipation could be interpreted as a sign of bodily imbalance. A strange color in the urine was enough to make the entire court fear illness or bad omens. And the groom of the stool was the first person to see it all. The irony lies here the closer they got to the most human and vulnerable aspects of the monarch. The closer they moved to the epicenter of power. Behind that closed door, there were no civil or military officials, no eyes or ears of rival factions, no ostentatious ceremonies. There was only a king temporarily shedding his cape and his mask of authority. In that highly vulnerable state, humans tend to speak more truthfully than normal. A complaint about a depleted treasury, a suspicion regarding a close advisor, frustration with an arranged political marriage, or even the fear of rebellion and death. And the groom of the stool heard it all. The man holding the wiping cloth next to the throne gradually became a living archive for the kingdom's most sensitive secrets. by skillfully planting a few words in the king's ear at the right moment. They could influence official appointments, alter financial policies, or quietly elevate their own family deeper into the ranks of power. Not a few grooms of the stool later became close advisors, masters of the treasury, or figures wielding influence on par with ministers. They climbed to the political summit not with swords, nor by bloodline, but through absolute submission inside a closed room smelling of aromatics and royal waste. Human history sometimes operates on chilling paradoxes like that. There are people who must use their very lungs and bare hands to dredge up the filthiest things in society, just to trade for a few spare coins and a hard loaf of bread. But there are also those who step close to the center of absolute power, merely by quietly serving the most private vulnerabilities of a king. History is usually told through wars, thrones, and treaties written on parchment. But beneath that halo lies the sweat, blood, and tears of nameless people trying to scrape together a living for their families. And perhaps the most spine-chilling truth is that these professions never truly vanished. They were simply cloaked in a more modern shell. Today's society continues to run on people who must sell their health, grind down their nerves, swallow humiliation, and destroy their own bodies in exchange for rent, a meal, and a chance to survive. We need them every day, yet we don't even know who they are. Out of all these 9 professions, which one makes you feel the most suffocated? Leave a comment below. And if you want to continue digging into the darkest layers of human history, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next videos.